Now, Democrat Tim Walz and Republican J.D. Vance clashed on Tuesday at a vice presidential debate. The debate was surprisingly civil in the final stretch of an ugly election campaign marred by inflammatory rhetoric and two assassination attempts. The two rivals, who have forcefully attacked each other on the campaign trail, mostly struck a cordial tone, instead saving their fire for the candidates at the top of their tickets. Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris and Republican former President Donald Trump. The most tense exchange occurred near the end of the debate when Vance, who said he would not have voted to certify the results of the 2020 election, avoided a question about whether he would change this year's vote if Trump loses.
That we actually do have a threat to democracy in this country, but unfortunately, it's not the threat to democracy that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz want to talk about. It is the threat of censorship. It's Americans casting aside lifelong friendships because of disagreements over politics. It's big technology companies silencing their fellow citizens. And it's Kamala Harris saying that rather than debate and persuade her fellow Americans, she'd like to censor people who engage in misinformation. I think that is a much bigger threat to democracy than anything that we've seen in this country in the last 4 years, in the last 40 years.
This one is troubling to me, and I say that because I think we need to tell the story. Donald Trump refused to acknowledge this. And the fact is that I don't think we can be the frog in the pot and let the boiling water go up. He was very clear. I mean, he lost this election, and he said he did. 140 police officers were beaten at the Capitol that day, some with the American flag. Several later died. And it wasn't just in there. In Minnesota, a group gathered on the state capitol grounds in St. Paul and said, "We're marching to the governor's residence, and there may be casualties." The only person there was my son and his dog, who was rushed out crying by state police. That issue, and Mike Pence standing there as they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Mike Pence made the right decision. So, Senator, it was adjudicated over and over and over. I worked with kids long enough to know, and I said as a football coach, sometimes you really want to win, but the democracy is bigger than winning an election. You shake hands, and then you try and do everything you can to help the other side win. That's what was at stake here. Now, the thing I'm most concerned about is the idea that imprisoning your political opponents, already laying the groundwork for people not accepting this. And a president's words matter. A president's words matter. People hear that. So I think this issue of settling our differences at the ballot box, shaking hands when we lose, being honest about it, but to deny what happened on January 6th, the first time in American history that a president or anyone tried to overturn a fair election and the peaceful transfer of power. And here we are 4 years later in the same boat. I will tell you this, that when this is over, we need to shake hands this election, and the winner needs to be the winner. This has got to stop. It's tearing our country apart.
First of all, it's really rich for Democratic leaders to say that Donald Trump is a unique threat to democracy when he peacefully gave over power on January the 20th, as we have done for 250 years in this country. We are going to shake hands after this debate and after this election. And of course, I hope that we win, and I think we're going to win. But if Tim Walz is the next vice president, he'll have my prayers, he'll have my best wishes, and he'll have my help whenever he wants it.
Well, for more on this, let's cross live to London and speak with U.S. Republican strategist Greg Swenson, who's been monitoring developments. Great to see you, Greg. Let's begin by reviewing the debate between Democrat Tim Walz and Republican J.D. Vance at the presidential debate. How did each other's candidate demur and presentation style influence their perceived effectiveness? Like, how did you view the debate in general, first of all?
A clear win for J.D. Vance, but more importantly, I think most Americans and even some of the legacy media in the U.S., which is usually very hostile to Trump and to Republicans, they've even admitted that it was a bad night for Tim Walz and a good night for J.D. Vance. So, you know, he wasn't just polished and unflappable, but I think he won on the substance too. And as you saw in that clip, even when it's a delicate topic, you know, he handled himself well. This was refreshing, you know, for both sides. You know, it was better for the American people and the voters to have, as you pointed out, Georgina, you know, something that was more civil and cordial. So I think both candidates, you know, tried their best to handle themselves well. But I think JD did much better, first of all, but also he kind of reversed some of the opinions that had been created by the hostile media in the U.S. that he was, somehow mean or a bad guy, or they dug up old stuff about him, old clips from years ago, and I think they painted a picture about him, and he really reversed that last night. I think in many ways he basically gave swing voters and undecideds permission to vote for Donald Trump, even if they don't particularly like Donald Trump, because JD came off as really likable.
All right, talk to us about the differences when it comes to especially accepting defeat at the polls. I know that they had different issues, especially with Donald Trump not saying saying he may not accept that he definitely would win, but the differences between both candidates, especially their top candidates. I'm talking about that now. How did this reflect on the vice presidential candidates debate that was held?
I think, good for Tim Walz for bringing it up. It's an issue that definitely helps Democrats, because January 6th was an unfortunate moment. And I think Republicans get a lot of the blame for that. But remember, this wasn't Donald Trump that was in the Capitol building when Tim Walz was referring to they did this, they did that. Yes, one person did die. It was actually a protester who was shot point blank and she was unarmed, by the way, shot point blank by a federal officer. That's tragic. And I don't think it's a great selling point for Republicans, because it was just a bad day. But I think you have to look at the context of it. And that's twofold. One is voters are not really focused on it. The Democrats, I know they're going to bring it up as much as they can, but it's really not ranking as a top issue. And surely in the context of the 2020 riots, which Tim Walz was very involved in, because he let Minneapolis burn, and Kamala Harris was actually encouraging people to donate to philanthropic organizations to bail out some of the violent protesters that were killing people and vandalizing. So I think in the context, people look back, now that we've had 4 years to digest it, and look back and say, what was worse, January 6th or the riots of the summer of 2020? So again, I'm not arguing for either one, but there's a little context here that makes people kind of think, what I really care about is the economy and the border crisis. And those are the two things that rank 1 and 2 for American voters. There are other issues for sure. And I think surely Donald Trump will lose some votes because of January 6th and his connection to it. Even if it's indirect. But I think but I thought JD handled it well. And he talked about, he kind of, didn't defend January 6th. He just moved on to what American voters care about. And I think the threat to democracy thing has been a losing argument for Democrats. That's why the Trump and Republicans actually poll better on that issue, even though it's not a top issue for Americans, but they still poll better on it.
All right, let's look at another issue, or some other issues that may be top issues for Americans, the issue of immigration, abortion, and energy policy. How did these vice presidential candidates perform regarding those issues?
Well, I think JD did really well. I wish they talked more about the economy. He brought up the inflation many times. I thought he was very sharp to attach the fact that Kamala Harris has been vice president now for almost 4 years. Attach that to the inflation, which she helped cause, attach it to the border crisis, which she helped cause. So there is that affiliation. Again, those are the top two issues. So he did a good job of connecting it. I wish they had talked more about economic policy. They really didn't. On abortion, I think JD Vance won that argument because Governor Walz was caught in a lie, arguing that he didn't sign legislation, which he clearly did. I think, one of the admissions that JD Vance made, which I thought was really smart and very civil, was admitting that Republicans have not messaged well on that topic. But the reality is, when they do, they win, because right now, the Trump policy, the Republican policy, is sort of right down the middle with American, moderate American thought, that let's allow abortion up until 3 months or something like, consistent with European models. But the Democrat policy right now is taxpayer funded up until birth. And JD called Governor Vance out on that. Governor Vance stumbled He tried to say that he didn't sign that legislation when he actually did, allowing abortion up until birth and allowing doctors to walk away from a baby that's born in a so-called botched abortion. That's really extreme. And I think voters are looking at the Republican policy now as sort of boring down the middle, but the Democrat policy, again, taxpayer funded up until birth, no support for children that are alive, born alive. And that polls in America, Georgina, at 13%. In the Democrat Party, it polls at 18. And even here in Great Britain, in the UK, where, abortion is legal up until 20 or 22 weeks or something, that polls at 16 in the UK. So it's a losing argument for the Democrats. And I think JD did a good job of handling that last night.
All right, let's take a look at how they responded to issues regarding the violence in the Middle East, regarding Iran and the Middle East. So what were your views of how they responded or addressed the war that we're seeing breaking out there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it was obviously quite timely. And I've noticed they didn't really talk about China last night, the threats from China. They did not talk about Ukraine. But of course, given the timing with the attack on Israel from Iran last night, it was very timely. And I think, look, they both said the right things. The difference is Trump and Vance have been, on record as totally supportive of Israel. They signed, they executed the Abraham Accords when Trump was president in 2019. They're very supportive of Israel. And I think people look back at the peace and prosperity that we had in the Trump administration versus now, where there's chaos and war in the Middle East and other places. So I think just by the fact that voters understand that Trump has a proven record of peace in the Middle East and support for Israel, and at the same time, it can't be really taken too seriously from Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, because they've wavered on it. They say the right things, and then they say, there should be a ceasefire when Israel's under attack consistently. And also it points to something that I think was a major mistake for Kamala Harris by choosing Tim Walz instead of Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. A couple of things. One is, obviously Josh Shapiro is Jewish. That's why she didn't choose him. A lot of the pro-Hamas wing of the Democrat Party, which is not the majority, it's a small wing, but she kind of rolled over to the Hamas wing, the pro-Hamas wing, and chose Tim Walz because he was not Jewish and he was not as pro-Israel as Governor Shapiro is. But looking back, it's not only a big mistake because of what's happening now in the Middle East, and they're trying to backpedal on their past comments, but more importantly, Josh Shapiro would have done much better last night. J.D. Vance was in his own league. Tim Walz was not really ready for prime time at all, and that showed. Whereas I think Josh Shapiro would have been. He's a very good orator. He's very smart. Like J.D. Vance, he's a lawyer, and he polls at 60 in Pennsylvania. He's a very popular governor, whereas Tim Walz does not poll well in his own state of Minnesota. He let Minneapolis burn in 2020. And more importantly, when Kamala Harris chose Tim Walz, her numbers in Minnesota went down 5 points. So it really was a mistake in retrospect, and I'm sure it's one they regret. And they only did it because Josh Shapiro is Jewish.
Before I let you go, I just want to understand how this, or to what extent this would have a significant impact on voter decisions come November 5th.
Yeah, no, great question, Georgina. And I think normally I would say not much, because it might not, this is not going to move, the polls 5 points or more by any means. But because the election season is so short this time, Joe Biden wasn't kicked to the curb until late July. So it's been a very short election cycle. So I think there's more meaning to this debate. Secondly, there was only one presidential debate. But thirdly, and most importantly, this is such a close election. So if J.D. Vance last night moved the needle just a little bit, just a half a point, that could swing the election. I think, again, he gave permission to especially suburban women in Philadelphia and Milwaukee and Atlanta, as well as Detroit. He's really came out so much softer and more personable and likable. And if that moves the needle half a point, that's all it might require to swing those swing states to Trump and Vance.
Many thanks for your insights as usual. Thank you very much, Greg Swenson.
Appreciate
He is U.S. Republican strategist, and he's been monitoring developments from London. Thank you.